Hi, good evening. So we're really delighted to have Michael Wagner here. Michael's in the in journalism and mass comm, and what a central research question he has: how is democracy working? And so that, in the context of the Wisconsin idea, is perfect, right? And this is a very accomplished scholar, lots of publications, lots of important work, and he's worked on actual campaigns, and we're just delighted to have him. So here you go.
Thanks. I think I've got, yep, this seems to work great, so yeah, I'll probably wander a bit as we go. Well, good evening. It's nice to be here, and thanks for coming. I am a big fan of the Wisconsin idea. When my wife, who's also an academic, and I were kind of sorting through some different job offers 6 years ago now, the fact that we had already heard of the Wisconsin idea and believed in its mission was one of the things that tipped the scales to UW-Madison, and we have not regretted our decision to come here. And so I want to talk a little bit about communicating the Wisconsin idea in a polarized era, and I really struggled with how to do this. And, you know, from kind of a, oh, thanks so much, that's so nice of you. So from I have a little bit of a cold, so forgive me. But from kind of a straight up data perspective, right now we're in an era where university professors are trusted less than they have been in years past. Campuses often have big conversations, sometimes deliberative, sometimes full of spectacle, about what free speech ought to mean on campus and who ought to be given a microphone and an audience, and what the rules ought to be in a situation where someone has a microphone and an audience. And those things have been in the news across the country and on our own campus over the last couple of years. We've seen the Wisconsin idea drafted out of the mission of the university for a moment a few years ago, and drafted back in before any permanent changes were made. And so it's an important and interesting kind of topic where we find ourselves in an environment that's increasingly polarized. We get our information from an increasingly diverse array of sources, some good and some absolutely abominable. And what does that have to do with what we know, how we know those things, and how we communicate those things to the people of our state? And so what I'd like to do, maybe for 40 or 45 minutes and then take a half hour just to have a conversation together, is to talk a little bit about how communicating the Wisconsin idea in a polarized era operates, at least from my perspective. And so over the last 6 years, I think I've given 84 public talks around the state. You know, you sometimes talking about politics, sometimes the media, sometimes fact-checking, sometimes civil rights, but always with groups of people from the state, sometimes with a UW connection, sometimes without. And it's always, every one of those 84 times has been a pleasant experience. There's always been great questions. I've always learned something, which is something, that's how I know that things went well, is that it's not just me prattling on for an hour and a half, but me maybe loving the sound of my own voice for 45 minutes and then having a conversation with people. And so as I thought about what to do for like a class where we're thinking about the Wisconsin idea, but we also want to see what that research looks like, I decided to do a talk within a talk. I'm not sure if this is a good idea or not. Usually I road test these, but we're gonna see how this goes. And so what I want to do is I want to share with you some research that I've done collaboratively with people both here and in other places about national polarization and polarization in communication here in our own state. And throughout that information, step outside of the talk to have a conversation about how we communicate these kinds of ideas in the polarized environment that we find ourselves in today. So sort of if you're a Hamlet fan, a play within a play. If you're a Parks and Rec fan, we don't know what meta means. So when I go out and talk to people about the situation our country finds itself in, when we try to ask ourselves how well is our democracy working, how well is this American experiment going, we see that increasingly people see the world through partisan colored glasses. Presently, President Trump enjoys an 85% approval rating amongst Republicans around the country, but it's super easy to find great critique of President Trump, and if we look to the Democratic approval, we see that it's at 5% around the country. This is not unique to President Trump. President Obama left office at 88 amongst Democrats. just as easy to find the Hitler picture of Barack Obama. He left with 19% approval among Republicans, which always leads me to ask, what, if anything, brings us together? And this is where, when you're communicating the Wisconsin idea in a polarized environment, you think of something that tries to bring us together. And for me, the best answer is the jump around, because everybody loves the jump around. And it's a communal space where liberals, Democrats, liberals, conservatives, moderates, apolitical people all get together in support of something that's not precisely themselves, which is a little bit about like what democracy is in some ways. And so now the meta portion, or a meta example of the talk, one thing I think is really important when trying to communicate the work that researchers do with the community at large, with the rest of the state, the rest of the country, the rest of the world, is to figure out how the audience has come to the conversation. And that's usually by thinking about conventional wisdom about how something works. I'm forgetting who said this, but I think it was some philosopher said that it takes an extraordinary mind to try to prove the mundane. And that's what scholars spend a lot of their time trying to do, is demonstrate something like partisanship affects your vote choice, to which you're all saying, what a shock. Democrats tend to vote for Democrats, and Republicans tend to vote for Republicans. I can't believe it. And so what researchers often do is start with that conventional wisdom and then try to find a way to get beyond it. And so when we think about conventional wisdom and the polarized era in which we find ourselves, we tend to think red versus blue. We tend to look at a map like this and say, well, we have some of Big Ten country, the coasts, and Colorado and New Mexico are the liberal places, and we have the rest of the country, including most of the Northwest, most of the plains, and almost all of the South as places that support Republicans. And this is the typical story. But this is a very peculiar way to think about the country, and it's a very weird way to communicate the Wisconsin idea in and of itself, because this is an unfair representation of the divides in our country. The map overrepresents states that are large in area but small in population. So Montana is a big part of this map, but not a lot of people live in Montana. And so that's an interesting way of thinking about polarization. So if we can, if the research is appropriate, try to upend that conventional wisdom. And so when we talk about polarization, we can complicate things and talk about size and say, oh, well, all of a sudden Montana is gone, and Illinois got bigger, California got bigger, Florida and Texas are large, New York and Pennsylvania are larger. A lot of these states here, your Colorados and Wyomings are much, or here's Colorado, I guess, but Wyoming much smaller, and so things are very different. But of course, this is still not fair, because if Hillary Clinton won a state by one vote, that whole state turns blue. And if Donald Trump wins a state by one vote, that whole state turns red. And that's not really a fair representation of the divide. And people vote not really in their state. And the Supreme Court itself has said the fundamental political unit of the country is a county. So if we look at counties, this is what the map looks like. And now we have a different idea of what polarization means, both in the country and in our own state. But this, again, is still not fair, because many of these counties are places where there are more cattle than people. And so we have that problem, so we go by size and county, and now the map looks increasingly complex, where there are large cities. Those tend to be the big blue bursts, by and large, on this particular map. But of course, this still isn't fair, because if you win by one vote in your county, you still turn all blue or all red. And so the most fair thing to do would be to say, let's shade darker blue for big Hillary Clinton wins, and darker red for big Donald Trump wins, and purplish for things that are in between. And what do you see when you look at this map? Might be something a therapist would say to you someday if you brought this in. And so now, at this point in my polarization talk, I usually have an audience thinking, okay, well, this is sort of interesting. We were thinking about red versus blue, but in a different kind of way. And I want to find a way to not only upend conventional wisdom, but introduce a puzzle. And so when we communicate the Wisconsin idea to broad audiences, one way to get people engaged, especially in a polarized era, is start with a question that doesn't have an obvious answer. Is to start with a question that doesn't have a clear Republican answer or Democratic answer or liberal answer or conservative answer. And so for me, that starts with back to conventional wisdom. When we ask people how they think of themselves ideologically, when we ask, do you think of yourself as conservative, moderate, or liberal, this is what the data from the Gallup organization show us from 1992 to 2016. And what we can see from this particular figure is that over the last 20 years, more people call themselves liberal now than did when Bill Clinton was first elected. About the same number of people, in fact exactly the same percentage of people call themselves conservative, and less people call themselves moderate. At the same time, there's more independents than there ever have been. There are more Democrats than Republicans, but not by much, and there's an increasing number of people who say they're independent, and yet moderates are dropping. So that's sort of interesting. So there's a puzzle. Why are there more independents but less moderates? That's a weird thing. However, the usual way of thinking about politics works for the people we send to represent us. And so I'm showing you data from 2005 and 6 so that I can show you that there used to be a couple of people in the middle. If we showed you data from 2016, there would only be one person left. And so this data comes from 2005 and 6. And the horizontal axis here represents voting behavior of US senators on economic issues. Further to the left the senator votes, the more to the left those Ds are on this figure. The further to the right they vote, the more conservative they are. So tax cuts bring you to the right, redistribution of wealth voting sends you to the left. But those aren't the only kinds of issues people disagree about. People also disagree besides about questions of taxing and spending, they disagree about questions of moral right and wrong. And so this vertical line deals with social issue voting. So the higher up you go, the more conservative you are. So outlaw abortion, define marriages between a man and a woman, support the death penalty. The lower you go, the more liberal you are, the opposite view on those same issues. And sure enough, most Democrats in the Senate are liberal across both economic and social issues. Most Republicans are conservative, and in fact are deeply conservative across those same sets of issues. Here, this D is former Senator Ben Nelson. He, along with Russ Feingold, are two of the people that were often called the 60th vote for the Affordable Care Act. After Ben Nelson voted for the Affordable Care Act, it was called the Cornhusker Kickback in Nebraska, and Nelson did not seek re-election. Here is an R way over here on the liberal side. That's Lincoln Chafee of Rhode Island, who's such a Republican he ran for president in 2016 as a Democrat. So there's Lincoln Chafee, there's Ben Nelson, they're gone. This lone wolf is Susan Collins of Maine, the last moderate in the United States Senate. But we have an interesting puzzle now. We have liberals, moderates, and conservatives behaving in the electorate, but we have just liberals and conservatives, no moderates, amongst the people who elect us. And if we look at the same graph, economic issues going one way and social issues going the other, and think, well, what about the people? Because the usual works for elites, but this is where people are. Each dot's a person in the American National Election Study, which is a study done every 4 years out of the University of Michigan, interviewing about 1,200 to 2,000 people around the country about their views about politics, their participation in politics, their knowledge about politics, that sort of thing. And so sure enough, we've got plenty of people who are liberal and plenty of people who are conservative. In fact, they make up just over half of the country. But we have almost as many people who are different. Libertarians are conservative on economic issues, but liberal on social issues. Populists are just the opposite. Populists are liberal on economic issues, but conservative on social issues. And there are some people who are, honest to goodness, just stuck in the middle. Some of those people are honestly ambivalent or torn, and some of those people are clueless and don't pay attention to politics. And it's really hard to disentangle who's who. So this is the electorate we have. That's the representation we have. And so how do we share ideas about research that we do to this audience without rankling this audience? Or should we even care if we rankle this audience? So once again, getting back to this figure, the usual, this interesting group of moderates. We have these people who say they're moderate. Who are these people? Well, if we go back to our 5 categories of voters I was just talking about a second ago, we have liberals. So this scale here, the lower you go, the more liberal you are. So a 1 would be very, very liberal, a 7 would be very, very conservative, and a 4 would be absolutely moderate. And this is the average placement of people in each of these categories. So the average liberal is just slightly liberal, but has gotten more liberal a little bit over time. The average conservative has gotten more conservative over time. And the libertarians, populists, and moderates are all precisely laying over each other in the middle. But libertarians, populists, and moderates, or at least populists and libertarians are just as divided on every single set of issues as liberals are from conservatives. And so when we ask, and people ask at almost every talk I give, why doesn't a centrist third party rise up and just be moderate? It's because the moderates are just as divided from each other as liberals are from conservatives. Politicians are a talented bunch, but they can't go around saying, I always want government out of your life. Vote for me, I'm a libertarian moderate. I always want government in your life. Vote for me, I'm a populist moderate. That's too much for even most politicians to be able to handle. And so we have this weird thing happening where about half of us are getting representation from at least one of the two major political parties, and the other half of us get halfway's representation from each, which puts those people in a really peculiar position. And so at this point, when you're communicating research to an audience, I think it's really important to think about three key concepts. First, be clear. So we're talking about 5 groups of voters, and hopefully we understand what those voters are. We have folks who are liberal on both economic and social issues. There are liberals. We have folks who are conservative on both of those kinds of issues. Those are our conservatives. We have people who are liberal on economic issues, but conservative on social ones. There are populists. And we have people who are liberal on economic issues, but are conservative on economic issues, but liberal on social issues, and those are our libertarians. And then we have folks stuck in the middle as our moderates. And so we need to kind of make sure that our audience is still with us and understanding. So do people have a sense of what these different groups are and where the problems might be beginning in our system? No one's giving me a no head shake, and silence means approval, so we'll move on. The second thing is to be transparent, right? So I'm always telling you where the data come from. Sometimes it comes from Gallup. Sometimes it comes from the American National Election Study. Sometime later it'll come from surveys that we've paid for here through grants or foundation research. And so it's always important to say, here's where our information comes from, and here's how we put that information together. So how do we put someone in a category of liberal, libertarian, populist, moderate, conservative? We ask them 20 issue questions. We ask them 10 questions about social issues, 10 questions about economic issues, their support for legal abortion, their support for gun control, their support for same-sex marriage, their support for tax cuts, their support for individual freedom in private living. So a wide set of issues, some more conceptual, some more concrete, and we saw where they answered all of those questions and placed them in a category depending upon how they answered all of those questions together. The other thing that's important is not to oversell. So I'm going to introduce some problems with our system, but I'm not going to tell us with any degree of confidence about how to solve them. And so it's important, I think, when you're with an audience communicating the research that we do, it's important to talk about the limitations of that work, and I'll return to that at the end of my talk. So to step back in to some of the research that we've done, this research is done jointly with Ted Carmines at Indiana, which we won't hold against him, and Mike Ensley at Kent State. And here we're looking at what are our different group memberships that, and again, it's not the case that the people in our studies are going around saying to themselves, I'm a populist or I'm a libertarian. No, we're putting them in those categories after we ask them questions. They're not aware that we put them in those categories. But we can figure out what they tell us about themselves, and what they tell us in the surveys we do is their partisanship. And so when we say on a scale from 1 to 7, where 1's a strong Democrat, 4's an independent, and 7's a strong Republican, where would you place yourself? This is the answers we get. And when Richard Nixon was president in 1972, we had a center-left country. The average member of each group was either kind of in the middle or slightly leaning Democrat. And if you look at the makeup of the House of Representatives and the US Senate at that time, they were overwhelmingly Democratic majority controlled. And yet the Electoral College and the kind of the ways that presidential elections work often have led to flip-flopping of Republican and Democratic administrations over that same time period. But most people are independent-leaning Democrat in the 1970s. Fast forward to 2016, and conservatives are now very Republican. Liberals are now the most Democrat. Populists are more Democratic. Libertarians are more Republican, but not by much. They're still stuck in the middle, and moderates are still kind of precisely right in the middle. And so we have these three groups all together, just about as big as the liberals and conservatives, who are stuck between two political parties that don't quite satisfy what it is they want. When we're thinking about what effects this might have on how we as scholars share our research, in our community and our state, it's important to think about how involved these different groups might be. Liberals and conservatives are the political participators. They're the ones who engage in more political activities. Yard signs in their yard, maybe a political button, giving money to a candidate, trying to persuade someone how to vote, those sorts of things. Whereas moderates, libertarians, and populists do that far less. But in terms of civic engagement, there's not a difference. So I'm not even showing the slide because they all look exactly the same. Liberals, conservatives, moderates, libertarians, populists all volunteer about the same amount. They all attend civic activities like a talk like this in about the same amount. Libertarians are slightly more participatory, and most research that examines that concludes is that libertarians tend to have higher socioeconomic status, and so they have a little bit more resources, which tends to make it easier to be participatory. So we're also interested when we communicate our ideas to people about where they get their information. And so where do people get their information in our country? That's changing dramatically. When we look at the network news, we see that liberals, moderates, and populists, and libertarians to some degree, are, between 30 and 40% likely on any given night to say they're going to watch the network news. And for those under the age of 30, that means ABC, NBC, or CBS. Those three networks, the anchor person delivering the news. Conservatives, the least likely group to watch the network news. This offers an example when communicating the Wisconsin idea to think about partisan difference. How we interpret this finding is really important. You'll immediately lose your audience if your audience is a bunch of liberals if you say, well, the reason conservatives don't watch the news is they believe that it's biased. But conservatives do believe that the network news is biased. And if you say the reason conservatives don't like to watch the network news is that it's not telling them that their side is right, you've turned off all the conservatives in your audience. And so the truth of the matter is we don't know why these folks are picking which source they're picking. We can ask them in other surveys, and we've done that, and I can talk about that in the Q&A if you like. But when you're being transparent and not overselling, when you're communicating the Wisconsin idea, you're saying, here's what we know. Conservatives watch network news less. Do they watch conservative programming more? Yes, they do. Do liberals watch it? No, they don't. Do other groups watch it? Not really. And so if you're a conservative, you might say, well, of course, this is the only place that's telling me, the other side of the story. And if you're a liberal, you say, well, of course, because you only want to hear that your side is right. So do liberals watch just liberal shows? No, they don't. Hardly anybody watches liberal programming. MSNBC's ratings are far worse on average than Fox News's, for example. Liberal talk radio comes around every few years and dies. Conservative talk radio continues to be very strong. People tend to sort themselves even on digital and social media when they seek out different kinds of sources. But liberals tend to go for more mainstream sources. Conservatives tend to go for more conservative sources. Now, if you are a conservative, you say, well, of course the liberals go for the mainstream sources. The mainstream sources are biased. And if you're a liberal, you say, of course we go for the mainstream sources. We want to hear both sides or multiple sides of an issue. And which of those groups is right is a great open question. So if we've had this kind of national picture of polarization in the electorate, and it affects our partisanship, it affects how much we participate politically, it affects where we get our information, what does our state look like, and how should we use that information when we're trying to communicate the Wisconsin idea to a broad audience? I think one way to think about this is just before I got here, with the protests and policy changes that came with Act 10. So Governor Walker's budget repair bill led to a large backlash from public workers, and we see protests not just in Wisconsin but all around the country. But here in Wisconsin in particular, there was a recall effort. And usually when there was a recall, that's the end of any kind of governor's term. Most governors who get recalled. Governor Walker beat back the recall, the only U.S. governor to survive one in our country's history. And so how did that happen? And how did that happen in the state that 5 months later Barack Obama won decisively? What's happening in Wisconsin that Governor Walker has won 3 statewide elections, Barack Obama won 2 statewide elections, Russ Feingold was senator for 18 years, Ron Johnson beat him twice, what's going on in that state? And what's going on in the state where Tammy Baldwin is up 11 points over Leah Vukmir, but Donald Trump just won the state a year and a half ago, or a little more than a year and a half ago now. And so here's what the map looked like in 2012 by county. We're doing the more fair version of shading it darker or lighter depending upon how close the county vote was. And then we move along to 2016, and we see the Clinton campaign did not recognize their vulnerability in these areas especially, and they didn't recognize the turnout deficit they were going to have in Milwaukee. And so the map changed quite a bit. And there was a lot of soft support. Why is there soft support for Barack Obama and Donald Trump? Well, we have lots of libertarians, populists, and moderates in our country who don't have fidelity to either one of the parties. And they tend to look for people who are talking to them directly and caring about their particular set of issues. And we saw one candidate do that more than another candidate in each of those three elections, 2008, 2012, and 2016. Something else that matters, I would say, in terms of how we understand our state is context. Context at the neighborhood level, the community level, the region level, all of these play a really important role in how we think about ourselves. And I find as I go around the state talking to people about polarization or the news media, that people deeply care about different kinds of contexts that they tend not to hear about when they are watching television news or even sometimes when they read their local newspaper. And part of that context comes in the way that we think about ourselves. Most people don't wake up and think to themselves, today is the day I get to hold my government accountable. I can't wait to hold my government accountable today, maybe on election day. But most people don't wake up and think that. People who come to talks like this are more likely to think that than others. But still, most people are thinking about the laundry or making their kids' lunches for school tomorrow or the thing they have to do at work the next day or traveling to see family on the weekend. These are things that dominate our lives. And they dominate our lives via different kinds of identities. And our partisan identity is super important when we vote, but typically not as important when we live. Our religious identity, our family identity, our identity is Green Bay Packer fans. I'm from Minnesota, so I'm a Vikings fan, but nobody's perfect. Hey, you'll win every argument you have with me about the more successful franchise. You can blow your like, I'm totally confident that the Vikings will ruin anything that looks like it might be good. Including quarterbacks for other teams, apparently. As we think about context, there are different kinds of identities, and sometimes those identities are wrapped up in emotions. And what my colleague and friend Kathy Kramer discovered in her book, The Politics of Resentment, is that rural consciousness is a big identity amongst Wisconsinites, even those who don't live in rural places, but people who believe in an identity about hard work and not being given things and not having other people be given things when they are not getting those same things, and thinking about how that can lead to different kinds of resentment that politicians might try to use to leverage into a vote. And so we've seen in our state politicians talk about what Madison and Milwaukee get and how those things aren't available in the rest of the state. And that may not actually be precisely accurate. It might be that per person, someone living in a rural county gets more state aid than someone living in our county or in Milwaukee County, but it's an easy kind of argument to make that gets people thinking about, well, why is my life hard? And if someone's getting something I don't get, they don't deserve it any more than I do. And so maybe I'll find a politician who's not going to give them something for nothing and maybe make my life a little bit easier. And so we've learned that the context people find themselves in is super important for how they think of themselves politically. But it's also the case that politicians don't have an unfettered access to us. Right? When Governor Walker runs for office and talks about what Madison and Milwaukee get, Tony Evers runs for office and makes a counterpoint. Right? Arguments compete in democracy, and when that happens, there are lots of opportunities for people to either change their minds or further kind of redress themselves into their views and become more entrenched as partisans. And so how does that process happen? It happens with the local media people get. It happens with who we talk to. Are we talking to family and friends more? Are we talking to coworkers more? It talks about the kind of media that we use. And so when communicating these kinds of ideas to an audience, getting back to the meta portion of the talk, I think it's important to root whatever we're trying to communicate to an audience as purveyors and kind of explorers of the Wisconsin idea in a way that stands on the shoulders of the work, especially the Wisconsin-based work that came before us. And so Devon Shaw and Jack McLeod are professors, but Jack's now retired in the UW School of Journalism. Here's Devon again. Chris Wells, professor in the journalism school up through last year. I'm one of the et als on this one. So we've done a lot of work in Wisconsin that looks at how media use and people's kind of sense of their own community affect their civic engagement. We've done research that shows how people have closed off political conversation with friends of theirs in Wisconsin, which I'll talk about in a second. And to understand how that works, we need to nest all of that. We need to nest who we talk to and where we get our information with the objective things that are happening outside of that communication. Like, is the economy growing? Are people moving to the county who make the county more homogeneous or more heterogeneous? Is the county getting bigger or smaller? Is everybody moving away? Or is it a place that people are moving to? And so in our research, we've gathered lots and lots of data about public opinion use. So we have about 40 waves of statewide polling of the state of Wisconsin from 2010 through 2018. We have about 10% of Wisconsin-based Twitter every day from 2010 forward. We have all of the conversations that Kathy Kramer's had with people around the state about their views about politics. We have interviews with elected officials, current and former, and members of the news media, current and former. We have 27 newspapers from around the state and the coverage they've done about politics, 10 TV stations around the state and their stuff, and podcasts from talk radio hosts. We haven't been able to find a way to capture previous talk radio episodes, but some hosts, like Charlie Sykes when he had a show in Milwaukee, would do podcasts that kind of were the highlights of their show. We've downloaded those as well. So we have a sense of all this different kind of communication. And we have a sense from our public opinion data of where folks live. Are they in the metro core, like Milwaukee and Dane County? Are they in the WOW counties? Are they larger counties but out, not near Dane or Milwaukee necessarily? Or are they the remaining counties? And so when we think about the context people find themselves in, what I find is that when I go to different places, people are in a far different context just by crossing a county line. And so for Dane County, for example, just looking at just the unemployment rate from 2006 to 2012, when the economy cratered right before Barack Obama's election, the unemployment rate nearly doubled even in Dane County and started to drop. And is even, if this went all the way to 2018, to be even far lower than 2006 right now. And so the context people find themselves in is different. The WOW counties had a different experience, much higher unemployment, but a little bit of a steeper recovery, and is now down to about where it was in 2006. But the rural counties have not recovered. Their problem was way worse, 12% unemployment as compared to 5.8 at its worst in Dane County. So thinking about the context you find yourself in when you're explaining your research, people have different needs, they have different problems, and they're going to interpret what we're trying to tell them in far different ways based upon the situation they find themselves in at the time that we get to meet them and share the work that we're doing, or try to begin partnerships with them, as many Wisconsin Idea projects try to do. Other kinds of issues also vary by county, and so it's less important, I think, to interpret this data other than to say we've looked at from 2009 to 2016 which counties have rebounded, going up economically, and which have gotten worse. And so Menominee, for example, worse. Dane County has gotten better. So we've gotten a sense of which counties are rebounding and which counties are not, compared to where they were right before the recession started. We have a sense of what's the population in those counties been like in terms of the demographic makeup. In other words, is the county becoming more heterogeneous, retaining more whites, or is it becoming more heterogeneous and getting more diverse? And so you can see that there's actually pretty big differences in those counties, and they're not necessarily related to the economic rebound. Economic rebound happens in a lot of countries that have become more diverse over the course of the last couple of years. And then at the same time, there's just plain old population increase or decrease. Which places are getting bigger? Dane's getting bigger, Menominee's getting smaller. What are the counties that are growing? What are the counties that people are leaving in great numbers? And then the task comes to put all of this stuff together. All of the Marquette Law School polls with their 41 waves of data, all of the contextual data I was just showing you, and all of the newspaper and other kinds of stuff. And rather than show you a bunch of statistical tables, I have them if you want to look at them, but rather than show you those, I just kind of want to give you a sense of what's driving different kinds of attitudes in our state. So when it comes to evaluations of Governor Walker, the more educated, the less supportive people tend to be of Governor Walker. Whites tend to be more supportive. Democrats tend to be less supportive. All that other stuff didn't matter. Whether the economy was getting better, whether the population of a county was growing or not, whether unemployment was changing, those things didn't affect support for Governor Walker. Over that same time period, evaluations of President Obama, younger people were more supportive, so the older one got, the less supportive they tended to be. Newspaper readers tended to be more supportive. Digital news users tended to be less supportive, and Democrats, not surprisingly, were more supportive. And in terms of evaluations of labor unions, the only thing that mattered was Democratic Party identification. Unemployment rates, economic rebound, none of that stuff affected what people thought, how favorably or unfavorably they thought about people who were in labor unions. And the same did not hold true, except for the partisan finding, for the Tea Party. And so when asking the same question, but instead of what do you think of people who were in labor unions, what do you think of people who were in the Tea Party, the more educated people were, the less supportive they were. The more they read newspapers, the less supportive they were. And the more they were Democrats, the less supportive they were. And so there's a lot of variance, but few direct effects of all of these contexts. And that just didn't feel right. Every time I would go to Green Bay versus Marathon County, I would find a different set of people with different kinds of concerns. And so one thing we wanted to know, and so we persuaded Charles Franklin, who runs the Marquette Law School poll, to ask a couple of different questions that we were really interested in. One of them was, when you talk to people about politics, do you talk to people who, is it just liberals? Is it mostly liberals? Is it an equal mix of conservatives and liberals? Is it mostly conservatives, or is it all conservatives? And there's a fairly normal distribution. Not many people say they just talk to liberals or just talk to conservatives. And almost half, 48%, and this data is from August, say they talk to an equal mix of liberals and conservatives. This might make us feel good. People are seeking out different kinds of people to talk to. It's also an answer that you want to give to a survey respondent. You know the right answer to give is, oh, I talk to a variety of people and not just people who tell me I'm right. But that's what people say. But we also have asked, and Charles has asked for us in surveys all the way back to the recall, have you ever stopped talking to a friend because of their views about the recall, or their views about Governor Walker, or their views about politics? And so depending upon the context, when the recall was happening, we asked about the recall. Now we just ask about politics. And it turns out 38% of Wisconsinites, virtually across years, say they've stopped talking to a friend because of their views about politics. This is not something that happened to us 30 years ago in the same way that it's happening to us now. And we're finding this not just in public opinion surveys, but when Kathy Kramer went back into the field, so her book, The Politics of Resentment, I'm forgetting the number, but somewhere between 40 and 50 groups around the state she would talk to. She would go to a place in Wisconsin, usually small towns, and say, where do people get together and shoot the breeze about politics? They would say, the Hy-Vee or the gas station. She would go, she would invite herself into the conversation and say, I'd like to understand how you all talk about politics and what you think about things. And so she would go back to these 40 to 50 places over time, and what she would find is that after the recall, she would go back and she'd say, oh, well, where's Gary? And someone would say, oh, well, he supported the recall, so he doesn't come anymore. Or he was, didn't support the recall and wasn't here anymore. And so people have stopped gathering with people they've gathered with every morning for coffee for years because of their views about politics. And so politics is affecting us in ways that we just hadn't imagined before. And so I just got done saying that we didn't have any effects for these contexts, but we do when we interact them with other kinds of variables. And so what you're looking at here is how often people talk politics with their friends and family. So the further to the right you go, the more people talk politics with their friends and family. The further to the left you go, the less people talk politics with their friends and family. And it's not really important who these groups are, but we have the strong Republicans at the top, leaning Republicans, independents, leaning Democrats, and strong Democrats. And then it's the same for evaluations of Scott Walker, Barack Obama, the Tea Party, and public unions, those four groups I was just talking about. In each case, the more people talk to their friends and family, the more amplified partisan difference becomes. And that's because we tend to be more like our family, then we tend to be like others. Now, everybody has a story about how they won't talk politics with someone at the Thanksgiving dinner table, but by and large, people select spouses in ways that are consistent with their politics. Again, not always, but by and large. And what we see here is the more you talk with your friends and family, the more partisan we become. When we talk with coworkers who are not picking in the same way that we're picking a spouse, we actually attenuate partisan differences. Not in great degrees, but at least in a direction that tends to moderate us a bit. And so the more we talk politics with people we work with, the less partisan we become. When we get news online, and when we use social media, so when we post on Facebook and Twitter and get into Facebook and Twitter fights with people, not surprisingly, we amplify partisan differences, just like when we're talking with friends and family. And so where we get our information from has a lot to do with not only what we think, but how we think about it, which is sort of interesting. If you just talk to different people, you might not have the same extreme attitudes that you have. Or if you just talk to family and friends, you might get more extreme than you are or I am right now. We also looked at those other kind of contextual variables. And what we found was that when population changes, when the population gets bigger, it tends to amplify partisan difference. When more people are moving into a community, there's more uncertainty. There's lots of newness around. What do people do when they are uncertain? They grasp onto things that they're familiar with. And so that partisanship is one thing people tend to be familiar with. People tend not to change their partisanship over time, and they get more partisan when their community gets larger. The same for economic rebound. When the economy is bad, we tend to be less partisan and more like, let's fix the economy. When the economy is good, we don't need to have that same kind of thought process, and we tend to, once again, amplify our partisanship. And so what are we to do? What do we do with this information as people who want to communicate the Wisconsin idea? Well, I think it's really important, first, to be authentic. It's important to share your own perspective as a scholar. Why is it that you want to investigate these things? I want to know how well democracy is working, how well might it work, what kinds of things do people support that might make things better? Do politicians support those things? What people support those things, what people don't? Whose voices are getting left out of those ideas? Those are things I'm really interested in. So they kind of guide a lot of the research questions I asked. It's also really important, I think, to be transparent about the data collection that you've done and what its limitations are, right? I showed you some data about media choice. I can't tell you whether that means that liberals like to hear both sides or whether it means the media are liberally biased. I can just tell you that liberals like the mainstream media more than conservatives do. And why that is, we have to investigate in other ways. And so it's really important, I think, to talk about the limitations of your data and what we don't yet know and what we might want to know in the future. And one of the great values of, for lack of a better phrase, prosecuting the Wisconsin idea is that when you talk to people who are not in your bubble, you learn lots of new things and lots of ideas for what I think are the most interesting things that I'm working on I get when I go out and talk to people in forums like this. I think it's also really important to be clear about what the major results are of any kind of research. So today, I think the major results are that the public organizes its ideas really differently than politicians do, and that has huge effects for who shows up to vote and who participates and who's more extreme and who isn't and where we get our information. And the economic situation the county finds itself in, the population situation it finds itself in, has indirect effects through the media we use and the people we talk to about how we evaluate our leaders. Whether that's generalizable to other states is something we're investigating now. And so in a few weeks, we're going to do a survey in Wisconsin, and then we're going to do that same survey in Ohio, North Carolina, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So 4 other kind of quote-unquote swing states. And see, is Wisconsin more or less like some of these states? And then we're going to try to anchor that with a survey in California and Texas, 2 states that are in no danger of becoming a swing state, to see is there something unique about being in a place where you see lots of political ads and have hotly contested politics versus being in a place where you tend not to in presidential elections. I think another thing we ought to do, especially for those of us who are interested in sharing the research that we do with folks in our state, is to use the local knowledge. It's an opportunity to learn anytime you're out giving a talk. And so, you know, I and other people in this situation, you know, have a PhD, we earned it, we worked hard for it, we're an expert in some small slice of the world, we share that expertise with people, and yet there's lots more things to know about that small slice of the world, plus the parts of the world that touch that slice of the world. And so using local knowledge, knowing that I'm in a county that hasn't economically rebounded and is growing, or I'm in a county that is much stronger economically, but people are leaving for some reason. That kind of stuff is useful when I want to go share research in places, when it kind of affects how I want to pitch my talk to people. And I would say the last thing is just to keep at it. I think the more you do it, the more you'll enjoy it. For those of you who are thinking about doing that sort of thing in the future. So I think it's right on 45 minutes. So I'll do as advertised and stop there and answer any questions you have and talk with you about the things you'd like to talk about. So thanks. Questions, comments, deep concerns? Yeah.
I've got one. How pervasive do you think is the situation where people might act or talk in a certain way, but then when they go in the voting booth, they do something completely different?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The best recent research I've seen about that is done by a scholar named Samara Klar. She's at, I think, the University of Arizona. I sometimes get that confused with ASU, but I think she's at Arizona. And she's done work on what she's called the shy Trump voter, right? How is it that Donald Trump outperformed his polling? Now, on the one hand, the national polls basically got it right. They said Hillary Clinton was going to win, and she won with about the percentage of the vote the average of the polls suggested. But polls in a few key places, like our state, were wrong. And they were wrong in a couple of ways. They were wrong on the presidential race, but they were also wrong in the Senate race. Russ Feingold led, I think, all polls but one from July 1st to Election Day and lost the election. And so that's pretty surprising in the world of public opinion polling. And so one explanation is the polls got it wrong. One explanation is people stopped polling a couple of days before the election and missed whatever swing happened those last couple of days. One explanation is there were shy voters who weren't willing to say they had what they thought was an unpopular position. And we know this is true in other kinds of research. When you ask people, would you vote for a woman to be president? Would you vote for an atheist to be president? Would you vote for a Mormon to be president? People know they're supposed to say yes, even though some people would not say yes to all of those questions. And so the one way that researchers try to get around that is doing something called a list experiment, where I do a public opinion survey of 1,000 randomly selected people, and then I randomly ask 500 of them this question. Tell me how many, not which ones, just how many of the following groups you could never vote for. Democrats, Republicans, astronauts, athletes. And then the other group, I say, how many, not which ones, just how many of the groups you could never vote for. Democrats, Republicans, astronauts, athletes, women. If the average is higher over here, it has to be because of women, because the two groups are the same in every other way. And so the average number, if that's one way we can get at people to reveal attitudes that they might not rather reveal. In Klar's work, she's found that there was evidence of some voters who were for Donald Trump and were less likely to say so when a human was on the other end of the line. And Trump did a little better in automated polling. So when you picked up the phone and it was, hello, this is a computer asking you, press 1 for Donald Trump and 2 for Hillary Clinton and 3 for Gary Johnson. Trump did a little better when people didn't have to say they were voting for Trump. We don't know whether that was true in states that got the state level polling wrong. And so there aren't enough observations to really know whether that's true. And so, so part of it might be that. Am I answering your question, or are there other parts that you wanted to explore?
It.
Great. There was a hand up over here. Oh, yeah.
So you talk about how things are different now than they have been before. So you've got polling results and you can track that. So we know there are certain differences. And then you try to correlate those differences with other changes.
Yep.
How do you address that issue of causality? We want to know why.
Right.
Why is this happening? And that's causality. How do you deal with that? How do you approach it? And what are the steps you have to take not to over causalify something?
Right. Yeah, so the kind of the results I was walking you through of the evaluations of Governor Walker and President Obama and labor union members and Tea Party members are all correlational. They're not causal. And so one way to deal with that is by doing good theorizing. So what do we think it's more likely that my evaluation of Scott Walker is going to make the county grow, or the county growing is going to affect my evaluation of Scott? So for some things it's easier than others, but for other things it's really not. And the best way for social scientists, in my view, to get at causality is to use a multiplicity of methods, but one of which ought to be experiments. And so where we isolate a thing that we think might be causing it and have that factor be in one condition of the experiment and have it not be in another condition, or have it interact in different ways. And I think one example that makes me confident that the media we choose are part of the causal story here are experiments that look at media use. And so one experiment that we've done is we've asked people to look at a Google News homepage. And they think it looks just like the regular Google News homepage, and all we've done is manipulate the sources that are listed next to each story. So whether they're Fox News or MSNBC or CNN or NPR or Breitbart, and we have the same set of issues for each set of participants, and we just vary which source it is. And so we know whether people are choosing because they like the issue or they like the source. And it turns out that conservatives tend to pick Fox News more than other sources. They tend to pick Breitbart a little less often, but more often than any other group. Liberals tend to pick not Fox or Breitbart, but they don't correlate to anything. They don't just pick CNN or just pick NPR. They're as likely to pick any of those, kind of looking like the correlational data that we had before. And so we have some evidence that people do selectively choose where to get information. But the other research in polarization in media suggests that actually watching it or reading it is what really exacerbates your attitude, right? It's not just that you decided to read the story about the Kavanaugh hearings on Fox versus MSNBC, it's that you go back night and night again to Rachel Maddow or Sean Hannity or whoever it is. And so in experiments don't get at that problem as well, because people are not random fans of Sean Hannity or Rachel Maddow. It's not that they sit down at the TV and say, well, what will I watch tonight? I'll close my eyes, press some numbers, and that's what I'll watch. They intentionally choose. And so other experiments have been done where we compare the results of what happens when we make you watch something that we thought you would like or thought you wouldn't like, versus when we let you choose. And when we let people choose, they tend to be less extreme. When we force liberals to watch Fox, they hate it. If liberals choose to watch Fox, they don't like it, but they don't hate it. And vice versa for conservatives. And so choice seems to matter too. And so experiments help with that. But then I think just talking with people. So qualitative interviewing, observing, I think that also helps, because you get a sense of what's driving people when you're talking to them in a way that you don't always get when you're asking them 17 minutes of survey questions when they're also trying to cook dinner or manage the kids or something else. Yeah.
Mine is a version of the first gentleman's question about people voting against their interests. I went to see Kathy Kramer speak about last spring, about 4 years after her first thesis was presented about the resentment in rural areas that she went and traveled in. And now that we've had all these years pass, and we've seen that roads are crumbling, we have some of the worst roads in the country, that schools are closing, that schools are consolidating, people are losing local control, they can't keep frac sand trucks off their county roads, or regulate that. They can't, shoreline zoning has been, take local controls taken away from them. And they still vote the same way, even though they've had all these experiences. And, she goes out and she finds the same thing. Why do you think that, people are so wedded to a particular ideology that the actual effects of these policies don't have an impact on them?
Yeah, I think that's a common. I get a variation of a question like this all over the state, and I think there's a few different answers to that question. One of which is that people like to be right, and people don't like to change their mind and have to admit that they were wrong. And this is true not just in politics, but in a variety of other ways that we communicate with each other. We are motivated. Social psychologists call this motivated reasoning. And it turns out the people who do it the most are the educated, because we taught them how to argue and use evidence to support their own ideas. And so when people see something happening that counters what they want, they're good at finding arguments to support what they want anyway. And lots of classic experiments in the recent years have shown this. And so why are educated conservatives the most likely to believe of anybody that Barack Obama wasn't born in Hawaii? Because they're better at developing counter-arguments. You can say, well, here's the birth certificate from the Hawaiian government. Well, that's not the long-form birth certificate. Okay, well, it was a birth announcement in the paper in Honolulu. Well, that was probably just done post hoc, right? People could always think of a counter-argument. The same for liberals. Why are liberals the group that are most likely to think vaccines cause autism when there's not evidence that they do? Well, it's that they haven't found the evidence yet, or they're suppressing the evidence, or the drug companies are, intentionally shading the evidence. And so it's those of us who spend time reading and learning that are able to develop counter-arguments. So one reason is that we're motivated reasoners, and that we like to be right. Another reason is that we don't always care about the things that other people think we should care about. So, for example, people have heard of the book What's the Matter with Kansas that Thomas Frank wrote a few years ago. And there's a similar thesis. Why are poor rural people in Kansas voting for Republicans when their economic interests are not being served by Republican policies? And a political scientist named Larry Bartels wrote an article called What's the Matter with Kansas? And part of the answer to this question is not everybody cares about whether the government is serving them economically. And in particular, conservatives might say, the government shouldn't be spending a lot of time serving me economically. I should be on my own. And so what I want the government doing is regulating traditional morality. And so people decide for themselves which issues are really important to them and which issues aren't. And they aren't always the ones that we might prefer them to think about as being the most important things. And then the other factor, I think, that's just as important as those two factors is that politicians are very good, or some are at least, are very good at building a case for why the bad things that are happening are other people's fault. And so if the roads are bad, that's because the other party won't let me do the things that would fix the roads. Or things were so bad when I took office that we have to get to that later. We had to just do triage at first. This happens on the left and on the right. It's kind of a blaming, or as Professor Kramer says, getting people to resent particular kinds of groups. And it's not hard to figure out which groups each side likes to get the other folks to resent. So I would say those things are probably, in my view, the three biggest contenders, but there's probably lots of other ones too. I saw, yes, in the pink. And then next.
Found any evidence of why liberal media, especially the liberal radio stations and outlets like Air America, keep crashing and burning? MSNBC is sort of hanging on over the years.
They do better in election years, especially. They tend to bump up a little bit in presidentials and sometimes in midterms. But yeah, so liberal talk radio hasn't worked for a lot of reasons. It could just be that the hosts weren't great, although a lot of the hosts are now hosts on MSNBC, or were, right? So it's not like Rachel Maddow was Air America, Ed Schultz, I think, was Air America, Al Franken was on Air America before he was a senator, before he wasn't. And then, so I'm not sure it's the entertainment factor. It seems like liberals tend to prefer shades of gray as compared to black and white. And so this happens in areas that aren't political at all. So for example, there's a classic set of experiments that try to get people to classify animals as farm animals or zoo animals. But some animals are ambiguous and in between. And liberals report enjoying that decision process a lot more than conservatives do. Conservatives have a harder time with shades of gray, or at least reportedly do, even when things that aren't political. Conservative talk radio is extraordinarily black and white. It's no mystery what Rush Limbaugh thinks about any set of issues. It's no mystery what Sean Hannity thinks. It's no mystery what Mark Belling thinks or what Charlie Sykes thought when he was on the air. Liberal hosts tell you what they think and then also criticize their own side quite a bit. They do more of that than conservatives do, which is a little bit more like traditional news media. Here's what one side says, here's what the other side says, the end. And so the market niche liberal talk radio didn't give people a great reason to go because it wasn't providing stuff that was different enough from a traditional balanced kind of indexing kind of news reporting. It was opinionated, to be sure, but it wasn't black and white. And when it was, liberals didn't like it. it wasn't as interesting to them. And so part of it was a market reason, and part of it's just what people tend to prefer. And part of it might be the quality of the hosts, or the amount of promotion they got, or the advertising support they got. All those things matter too. I'm probably underselling that a little bit. Yeah?
So when you're talking about the rural consciousness, which is fascinating. So as the U.S. moves to, as demography shifts the U.S. to a more and more urban country.
No, there aren't a lot of farmers anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the rural areas are being hollowed out fairly quickly. And so you said when people move to, when there's in-migration to a city, at least for some period of time, people sort of seek out like-minded others. But what happens over time? I mean,
yeah, that's a great question.
Is urban consciousness sort of antithetical to rural consciousness, and some kind of acculturation occurs over the period of time once people move to cities? So if somebody moves to Dane County, somebody moves to Madison from a small town. For the first couple of years, they seek out other conservatives.
Or even just people from small towns.
Right, some of that consciousness.
Yeah.
But 5 years from now,
what happens?
Yeah.
That's a really good question. The honest answer is I don't know.
Yeah.
The research that I'm aware of that's closest to this idea comes from, I think David Wilson does this, and other people do and Gallup did this for a long time, called Soul of the City studies. And what they would find was that the longer people had spent in more diverse places, the more their attitudes looked very different than they did when they hadn't spent as much time in those diverse places. And so the more supportive they became of policies that, especially if the individuals being interviewed were white, the more likely they would be supportive of affirmative action, the more likely they would be supportive of an expanded kind of set of spending on healthcare and education, and the more or the less racial resentment they would express. And so racial resentment is a kind of a scholarly concept that is a series of questions that you kind of average together. Questions like you agree or disagree on a scale with statements like, if black people worked harder, their lives would be better. Civil rights changes have happened too fast. Changes happening with African Americans are no different than changes that happened with the Irish and Germans, at the turn of the 20th century. So like a lot of these kinds of statements, and then people say whether they agree or disagree with those, and then you can kind of get a sense of who has different kinds of racialized attitudes. And people who, white people who live in urban areas for long periods of time express less of those attitudes. And so a lot of this stuff, like our data is kind of in a 4-year window. And so that's one reason we want to keep doing it, is to see are the short-term effects different than the long-term effects. We have reason to suspect that they'll be different, but I don't know if they're different. Yeah.
Kind of a follow-up on that, though. We talk about an election that's 55 to 45% as being a landslide.
Right. But if we put 55 people over here and 45 over there, we'd still struggle to which side was bigger. It'd take us a minute.
And even in Dane County, let's say it's 2/3 Republican, 1/3, 2/3 Democrat, 1/3 Republican. But that's still a third of the people. So it's really not all that homogeneous. And I think some of the first data that you showed captured that. And I wonder if a lot of the questions we ask, right? I wonder if a lot of the questions we ask aren't simply because this isn't what we see. We see those others where it's just this. Yeah.
We see this. Yeah.
And so my question would be, how much is there a rural consciousness? How much is there an urban consciousness? Or is it just trends that really people everywhere, in every area, there will be big overlaps. Sorry, let me start that again. In the rural areas, there will still be big overlaps in how people do things with the urban areas. It's just that the middles are farther apart.
Yeah, and even in Kathy Kramer's book, like, you know, people in urban and suburban areas expressed rural consciousness. And so I think the answer isn't that it's an or, but it's kind of an interaction, right? So there are always ideas about, people will always have ideas about what it means to be a rural citizen, and people will always have ideas about what it means to be an urban citizen. But exactly what goes into both of those soups will change a bit over time. And as people move, you know, people are pretty mobile, and as people move between communities or from large to mid-size or mid-size to small or small to large, those things will change a bit. But I think there'll always still be differences in the core identities of how those things operate. And I think that's even for those. It's like I live in Madison, you know, and so I think of myself as living in a city, but I grew up in a small town, and I still have many, you know, elements of my life that I would consider are rurally conscious. But you know, I'm very unlikely to move to a smaller community than Madison, and I like living in Madison, and so I have an urban consciousness as well. But you know, an urban consciousness in Madison is different than an urban consciousness in Chicago or Philadelphia or Atlanta, and so they vary quite a bit. So I would say there's variance within each way of thinking about who we are. There's stability in each of those ways, and then there's change as we move around. And it's, you know, luckily it's really complicated, so we can keep investigating it, I guess. Yeah.
So, you know, this course talking about the Wisconsin idea, where kind of the best ideas are supposed to be spread out into the state to benefit everybody. But then, you know, going back to Professor Kramer's work, the end result, I mean, what she's finding is there's resentment.
Yep.
Madison and other people. I mean, could that be framed as, wow, the Wisconsin idea failed? I mean, at least what we're looking at right now, what we're looking right now.
I think it's worth asking that question. I teach fairly regularly kind of an intermediate reporting class, and we end the semester with kind of a 4-week final project where the students pick something to investigate as a group. They get assigned particular stories to do it. And 2 years ago, they investigated the Wisconsin idea. Or maybe it was 3 years ago now. Whenever the hoo-ha was about whether the Wisconsin idea would be written into the state charter for the university anymore. And so they did a set of stories on, well, are we just kidding ourselves with this Wisconsin idea? Is it something that we say to feel good about ourselves because we want to think of ourselves as people who are not just ivory tower conscious, but state conscious, rural conscious, you know, going out into communities and sharing our work, but also partnering in those communities on projects that can help make lives better in those communities. And the reporting the students did found that the university has relationships in every county of the state and does things with varying degrees of success. Some things worked really well, some things didn't. And so I think it's going too far to say that it failed. But it's certainly the case that the university needs to do a better job of communicating its value. But it also needs to do a better job of having the value. But I think it has the value in pretty good course. But communicating that value, I think, is really important. And helping individuals understand this nice thing that happened was partially the result of a partnership with UW Extension or with someone at UW-La Crosse or whatever it was, is valuable. And in the last couple of years, at least on our campus, I've seen more of that happening. This seminar is an example, but I know Chancellor Blank has been big about going out into the counties around the state and saying, here's what the university system in UW-Madison is trying to do in this place. It's not just that we're trying to persuade your kids to come to Madison and then never send them home. That's not our goal, right? And so I think that, you know, the part of it's a communication problem. Part of it's a results problem. And part of it is that the Wisconsin idea exists independently from and interacts with the political environment we have. We always want to be doing this, but sometimes that's more popular politically than others. And sometimes what professorial behavior gets in the news is more or less helpful for that endeavor. Oh, yeah.
So I want to follow up a little bit on that. One of the more striking things I heard tonight was that you go out many times a year. I did the math, 8 or 9 times a year to speak around the state. I have two questions about that. One, do you use that as a way to learn? Is that built into your studies? And then two, getting to this notion that you just talked about, reaching out to the state. Is that a way, much as Kathy Kramer did, to bring the presence of the university to the state, to bring the Wisconsin idea to the state? You talked about how you're very careful to evaluate the audiences, and so you're trying to connect with them. That's part of the Wisconsin idea. So those two questions really: is this are you a premier example of the Wisconsin idea in action? And then also, what do you get from it from a research perspective?
I don't know if I'm a premier example, but I aspire to be one.
Yeah.
I like doing this, and I like learning. I always learn every time I go out and talk to people. And it's almost always something that either helps the research I'm doing or the teaching that I do in the classroom. It helps me even understand where some students are from. And so, the first year I got here and people would tell me where they were from, and, I'm from Minnesota, so I knew mid-sized cities in Wisconsin and stuff about the bigger cities, but I didn't know Wisconsin like I know it now. And having been around and talked in lots of places to lots of different kinds of people, it's made me a better teacher of the students that we get, I think. But it's certainly taught us a lot about what we want to do in our research. And so when we're doing public opinion surveys or experiments, we're often sometimes building on a nugget that came out of something like this, where, somebody said, it was a really interesting question about why aren't people pursuing their interests? And yeah, we've had the whole Thomas Frank, Larry Bartels fight, but people still have this question, so let's think of other ways to investigate it. Let's think about how people define what is important to them. And let's think about what politicians tell them should be important to them. And sometimes those things match, and sometimes those things don't match. And so that's affecting some of the work that we're doing. Did I get both parts of that? Or did I? Okay. Yeah.
When you go to all these places around the state, do any of the people that you talk to ever talk about the Wisconsin idea? Do you have any sense that people know that there is such a thing, or that the university became famous because of it? Or?
So if you didn't hear the question, it was when you're talking around the state, do you hear people mention the Wisconsin idea? And I would say when it's a university alumni association event. So if it's like a Badger Cafe in Green Bay where alums of UW-Madison or UW-Green Bay come to the talk, they are aware of it. If it's I went and gave a talk in Marathon County a couple of weeks ago at the public library, and that it didn't come up. I don't know if people knew about it or not, but it didn't come up. And so I would say that the more overlap there is between people with a tie to the university and the event, the more likely people are aware of it. It's a little bit like speaking to the choir, but it's a pretty large choir. And I'm not personally bothered if someone in an audience doesn't know that one reason I'm there is because of something called the Wisconsin idea. If they get something out of it, that's okay. That's good. Yeah.
I have to confess I come from a business background, so how do we measure whether the Wisconsin idea is succeeding or not?
That's a great question, right? So the university will tell you that there's some astronomical number in the billions that, thanks to the university, that's what gets produced in the state. And so I know on the university's website there's all sorts of graphics and evidence to how much economic activity is produced thanks to the university. I should start carrying those numbers around. I don't know what they are. But so I would say, patents, investments in small businesses, graduates working in the state, graduates returning to the state. Those are probably all ways that we could measure success. We could measure success by asking people. So when we know there was a university community partnership, not just having the partnership and then wiping our hands and walking away, but then returning and asking people, was that valuable? Did you get something out of it? So I would say there's probably some quantitative markers we could get and some qualitative ones too. I know the university people who are in charge of those things look at that, but I'm not as conversant on that as I should be. That's a good question, though. Yeah, in the back.
You haven't mentioned gender, and do you feel that gender polarization perhaps in Wisconsin is more issues or ideology?
My take is that it's more partisan. And so, I don't have the data so in front of me. There's women as a group are really heterogeneous politically. Republican women behave a lot more like Republican men, and Democratic women behave a lot more like Democratic men, which is another way of saying that Democratic men behave a lot more like Democratic women, and Republican men behave a lot more like Republican women. So the partisanship tends to be a better predictor of people's attitudes and behavior than gender. In this particular election cycle, educated Democratic women and educated liberal women, which are close to the same thing but not exactly the same thing, are far more supportive of Democrats in this election cycle than they were in 2016. And so there's been a shift amongst educated Democratic women to be more supportive of Democrats than they were in 2016, especially white women. African American women were already highly supportive of Democrats in 2016. So there's been a shift in that regard amongst Democratic women. But by and large, the differences are more partisan than they are gender-based. There's just as many women, for example, on either side of the abortion issue as there are men. As an issue that we tend to think of as a woman's issue, if we want to talk about that in that kind of way.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
It's been wonderful.